My name is Richard Schmidt. I'm a native Chicagoan, born here in 1954. I work downtown for a real estate company. I'm also a part-time teacher, university teacher, and I was born on the south side of Chicago. My great-grandparents immigrated from Germany, moved to Chicago in about 1889, 1890. And my great-grandfather actually worked at Jackson Park during the World's Fair in 1893, and they were long-time, all their lives, Southside Chicago residents, living in Hyde Park in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. My grandfather was great-grandfather was a lifelong florist, worked for the city and so forth in the Park District, Jackson Park, and owned his own florist shop. And my grandparents were born also on the south side in Hyde Park and grew up there and moved to Beverly in the 1920s where my mom was born. So I have a lot of historical memories that aren't my memories, but stories that were told by grandparents and so forth. By the time I came along, my grandparents were living in Roseland, far south side, around 106th in Michigan, down the hill as they called it, and at that time Roseland was largely Dutch, German, and Italian, with the Italians all living down the hill at the bottom of the hill as they called it. It's also where my mother learned to drive because Roseland was known for all of its steep hills, and she learned how to drive a manual transmission there in the late 40s, so I've been told before I came along. I was born and raised on the south side. We lived in South Shore for about 10 years, my first 10 years, and then we moved further west and south in the what was called then the Brainerd-Beverly area. So a lot of my memories have to do with that area around 95th between Halsted and Ashland. There's a large park, or at least it seemed large at the time, a neighborhood park called Brainerd Park. It may be renamed by now. There was about 2 square blocks, and what current residents may not realize was in the 60s, 50s and 60s, and probably early 70s, almost every park had ice skating during the winter time, which meant that the city simply put out a hose and flooded the entire middle of the park, which was normally the baseball diamonds, and there was no worries about safety or liability and so forth. So you would just go out there and skate or play hockey and so forth until well after dark, obviously in the winter time. It's hard to believe it. Those neighborhoods were very safe at that time. A lot of the stories, Chicago neighborhood stories that I recall, have to do with characters who were born and raised in Chicago. My grandfather was an actor before and during World War I, and he quit acting in the 20s to marry my grandmother, but he and my uncle were both actors. They were partners in an acting company, and they did stage and some minor screen when there was still S&A studios in Chicago around 1914, 1915. And my grandfather continued to do some amateur theatricals and so forth, but would always drag out the makeup kit, even when I was a kid, and scare the heck out of most of us as children in the late 50s and early 60s. Chicago to go to graduate school and everything. I lived in Toronto for several years and moved back to Chicago in '92, and I was amazed at how much the city had changed in about 12 years. As I said, native Southsider, but I've lived on the north side since '92, and going back sometimes to those old neighborhoods, it's very interesting because even though a lot has changed, a lot remains the same. And some of my favorite recollections of that stretch along 95th between Ashland going east to past Halsted. There was an old Catholic girls' school convent, I believe, at 95th around, I think it's Loomis or so. And when I was small, we used to walk past there, and then I, of course, have heard stories from my parents of what they were told back in the late 20s, because neither one of them was Catholic. They were told that, of course, the nuns imprisoned the young girls inside the convent, and that's why, of course, the convent had these large wrought iron fences with the tall spikes on top of the brick wall. These are the kinds of urban myths that are very interesting, because of course they get passed down probably from generation to generation. That school, I believe it's still a convent, is still there, looking a little bit worse for wear. But it's a stretch of the south side that eventually I think will come back. There's too much good real estate and so forth there. A lot of stuff going down Ashland from all the way from 95th clear down to 63rd, which has changed quite a bit. But back in the 1960s, and I'm sure in the 50s, there were several movie theaters on 79th. So when I was a child, my mother, who also was very much a South Sider, after my father passed away, would usually take me to the movies on Saturday nights when I was about 10, 11, 12. And back then you had your choice of going to the Highland, which was at 79th and Ashland, which had this incredibly interesting candy shop where they sold the hot cashews and everything right next to the movie theater. And back then movie theaters didn't question whether you brought anything in with you. They didn't force you to buy their own overpriced products. But if there was nothing good at the Highland, which had the nice stars in the ceiling of the theater and the balcony and so forth, you could hop on the 79th Street bus and go, oh, what would that be, 8 blocks down to Halsted, and you had the Capitol, which was another one of those beautiful old kind of Art Deco theaters, which I think is still standing, although it's used for something else now. And the Capitol was much more ornate than the Highland, and it was usually a special treat. So probably a lot of the late 60s, mid-60s films that came out were first run there, as well as in the old Loop theaters. Even though that wasn't really our neighborhood, the 79th Street bus and the Ashland bus, as well as the Halsted bus, were just sort of the main means of communication, transportation, meeting people, seeing the street life. Some of it not probably the best thing for children to see back then. And we didn't, of course, realize it, but there were certain kind of dark and sleazy bars on 79th that were certainly intended for adults only, but that just seemed to be part of the neighborhood. And at that time, it's hard to believe, 45 years later or whatever, or 50 years later, that when I was a kid, my grandparents basically just gave me a couple of quarters and a dime and said, okay, find your way downtown on the L, and just call from a payphone when you're on your way home. And nobody thought back then of worrying it that a 10 or 12-year-old kid was just traveling on public transportation by himself and may not get home until 9 o'clock or something like that. So those neighborhoods have changed quite a bit. The north side has changed quite a bit, but it's still some of those neighborhoods are still interesting to explore. I sometimes don't like going back to old neighborhoods to see, you sort of maintain an image of what things looked like at the time, and it's interesting. Sometimes it's a little sad to go back and see that things have changed dramatically, or that buildings aren't there anymore. And it's kind of odd working downtown, which is obviously a different neighborhood from where I grew up. But I worked downtown on Clark and Madison, right across from the what's now called the Chase Bank Building, the Chase Tower. But of course, when it first went up, it was the First National Bank Building. And again, when I was a relatively small child, we used to go to restaurants on Clark across from where the Chase Tower is now, and those were all 3-story buildings before they built the newer buildings, and there were all these old interesting Chinese restaurants and everything. Again, it was kind of run down, sleazy and everything, but if you knew where the good restaurants were, or if you knew where the good seed stores or collecting stores and so forth were on the second or third floor of some of those old buildings. You could find all sorts of interesting things. It was in some respects a different Chicago. Probably downtown wasn't as clean and squeaky and appealing to tourists, but in some respects a lot more interesting if you were a kid growing up and just kind of with a sense of exploration. What many children growing up now in the city don't realize when they go downtown is how high the curbs used to be. Long before the ADA and everything, mandated that the curbs all be lowered for people in wheelchairs and whatnot. It used to be, especially if you were 10 or 12 years old, that whenever you crossed the street downtown at, say, Clark and Madison, you actually had to step up because the curbs, the sidewalks were all probably about 14, 16 inches above street level. That's all gone, which is fine. It's just very, very different. So when I think of Chicago, and like if we drive back through Jackson Park or something like that, in some respects I see it almost in black and white sometimes in some of the neighborhoods. I mean by that, I see images that are from, photo albums that were preserving pictures that are still somewhere in my apartment from the 20s, the 30s, and so forth, long before color photography. And it kind of lends a certain tint to those neighborhoods because you almost imagine the city or some neighborhoods or street corners looking the way they did. Obviously, they were really in color at the time, but it gives a kind of image of the city, which is the history of the city. And I think sometimes when we look back or we go back to old neighborhoods, we are looking through that kind of filter. The last time I was on 79th, driving under a viaduct going east, almost to east of the Ryan and so forth, people warned me about a viaduct you pass under, and and my question was, well, why are you warning me? It's broad daylight. And they said, no, don't worry, it's nothing like that. It's that there are too many broken bottles and you have to dodge the bottles and the potholes. But otherwise, a lot has not changed. A lot of the buildings are still there, and I find it interesting. There's a lot more history in some respects in those old neighborhoods than there are in the ones that have been completely gentrified and remade and recast. So as a writer, as a teacher, and so forth, I find Chicago still a very rich place to explore. The people, it's not just the memories that I have growing up, or even coming back in the 70s, late 70s, and driving without really being very careful and parking my car on 47th when there were still blues clubs on 47th, and then being told by one of the people outside the club, did you pay somebody to park your car? In other words, to watch your car. Again, even 47th has changed quite a bit. It's cleaned up a lot, probably for the better in terms of the safety of the neighborhood. But I think they've also lost something. They've lost a little bit of that dinginess, and you never quite knew how far down the block some of the brothels were and so forth. And I'm not always the most observant, so I probably didn't even notice that the brothels were between the bars and the checkerboard lounge and everything else that used to be there. So it's stories like that, and you can kind of revisit them, and it's kind of interesting to revisit them when you're also thinking of what you see, or what you saw, I should say, maybe 30, 40 years ago. It lends like several layers of how you see the city. And it's probably it. Thank you.
Thank you.